You will see a wall, thick enough to build houses on top of, fall flat to the ground without a single blow struck against it. You will hear a woman lie to soldiers pounding on her own door, hiding two strangers beneath stalks of drying flax, and tie a rope the color of blood to her window as the only proof she ever needs. And you will hear one man stand before an entire nation and ask a single impossible question, one you will have to answer for yourself. Every leader who has ever taken over from someone great has faced the same quiet fear. I am not him. Moses had spoken with God face to face. Moses had split a sea. Moses had carried a nation through the wilderness for 40 years, and now Moses was dead, and a soldier named Joshua stood alone at the edge of a swollen river, staring into a land full of walled cities and armed giants he was expected to conquer. But by the end of this story, you will hear the words God spoke to Joshua in that moment. Words Joshua would have to repeat to himself again on the worst night of the campaign. And you will understand why a foreign woman, a prostitute living inside an enemy city, ended up saving Israel's future and being written into the family line of the Messiah himself. This is not simply a war story. It is the story of what happens when you are handed a mission someone else started, a promise you did not earn, and a fear you cannot outrun, and what it costs to move forward anyway. Moses was buried in a valley no one could find. The people of Israel wept for him for 30 days, and when the weeping was done, the camp was left with a silence no general, no elder, no army could fill. Into that silence, God spoke to a man who had spent 40 years standing slightly behind someone else. Joshua had carried Moses' tent equipment. Joshua had stood guard outside the tent of meeting while Moses spoke with God inside. Joshua had once climbed a mountain of spies into Canaan and come back with a report nobody wanted to hear, that the land could be taken if only the people would trust God enough to walk toward it. For that report, an entire generation had called for his death. He had waited 40 years for the men who wanted to stone him to die in the wilderness. Now they were dead, and he was standing at the front of the line. "Moses, my servant, is dead," God said to him. "Now then, you and all this people arise. Go over this Jordan." The river in front of him was not a river at flood stage by accident. It was harvest season, and the Jordan had swollen over its banks, brown and fast, swallowing the low ground on either side. There was no bridge. There was no ford shallow enough to trust. There was only water, and on the far side, a land defended by cities with walls thick enough to build houses on top of. And there, at the edge of that river, God said the words that would carry Joshua through everything that came after. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joshua did not answer. He stood at the water's edge with the words still settling into him, the current pulling debris past his feet, and said nothing back. There was nothing to say back. There was only the choice of whether to believe it. He gave the order to move. Before the people crossed, Joshua sent 2 men ahead into the city of Jericho. Not soldiers marching in formation, but 2 men slipping quietly through the gate at dusk, eyes down, trying to look like nothing.
Up here.
They found a room to stay in above the house of a woman named Rahab. built into the city wall itself, her home literally part of Jericho's defenses. She knew who they were before they said a word. Word had already reached Jericho of a sea that had split in two, of an entire Egyptian army swallowed by water, of a wilderness people with a god who did not behave like other gods. Rahab had heard the stories, and unlike the soldiers guarding her own gate, she had believed them. When the king's men came pounding on her door demanding the spies, she hid the two men under stalks of flax drying on her roof, and looked the soldiers in the eye and lied. The men went out, she told them. I do not know which way they went. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them. The soldiers ran off into the dark, chasing men who were still on her roof. She climbed up afterward and found the spies in the shadows, and this time she did not lie. I know that the Lord has given you the land, she said. Our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. A woman inside the enemy's walls had more faith in Israel's God than most of Israel had shown in 40 years of wilderness wandering. She asked for one thing in return, that when the city fell, her family would be spared. The spies gave her a scarlet cord to hang from her window, a mark visible from outside the wall, a sign for the invading army to pass over her house. She tied it there and waited. A rope the color of blood hanging from the wall of a condemned city was the only thing standing between one family and destruction. That is where the beginning of this story ends, not with Israel already victorious, but with a river too high to cross, a city too strong to break, and a woman inside enemy walls who believed a promise before she had any proof it would come true. The Jordan did not part because Israel was strong. It parted because the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant were willing to step into the water before it moved. Think about that for a moment. Not after the water stopped, before. Their feet had to touch a river still flowing at flood stage, still moving fast enough to sweep a man off his footing, and only then did the water upstream stop, piling up like a wall while the riverbed dried beneath their sandals.
Look at what he has done.
Faith rarely gets to see the miracle before it commits to the step. The whole nation crossed on dry ground, while the priests stood in the middle of the riverbed holding the ark, water banked up on either side like a memory of what used to be there. When the last person crossed, the priests stepped out, and the Jordan roared back to life behind them, swallowing the path they had just walked. There was no way back now. There was only forward, into a land with a city in front of them that had never once, in living memory, opened its gates to an invader. Jericho shut itself in. The gates were barred. Nobody went out, and nobody came in. Behind those walls, they waited for an army to arrive with battering rams and siege towers. Instead, an army arrived with a trumpet. For 6 days, Israel marched around the city in silence. No war cries, no taunts, just the sound of feet on dirt and 7 priests blowing horns of ram's horns in front of the ark. The soldiers of Jericho must have watched from the walls in confusion, then in mockery, then in something closer to unease, as the same silent procession circled their city once a day and walked away again. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. And on the 7th time around, the priests blew the trumpets, and Joshua gave the people one instruction. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. They shouted. The wall fell down flat where it stood, and the army walked straight into the city over the rubble of what used to be Jericho's defense. Every soldier in that city that day trusted stone. Every soldier in Israel that day trusted a shout. In the chaos that followed, two men remembered a scarlet cord hanging from a window built into the wall. They found the house still standing, the only house still standing, and brought Rahab and her whole family out before the city burned. A woman who had chosen faith over the safety of her own people ended up grafted into Israel, into its history, and centuries later, into the family tree of Jesus of Nazareth. The wall came down on everyone who trusted their own strength. It stayed standing over the one household that had trusted God instead. Victory like that should have made Israel unstoppable. It made them careless instead. The next target was a small city called Ai, a fraction of the size of Jericho, and Joshua sent only a few thousand men, confident the town would fall as easily as the last one had. Israel's army walked toward Ai, already tasting the win. Ai's men came out and routed them. Israel ran. For the first time since crossing the Jordan, Israel's soldiers turned their backs and fled, and the men of Ai chased them down and killed enough of them that the whole camp's courage broke at once. Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down before the ark until evening, dust in his hair, asking God why he had ever brought them across the river, only to let them die at the hands of a city they should have swallowed whole. You know this moment. Maybe not the battlefield, but the version of it that lives in an ordinary life. The day the thing you were sure would work falls apart in your hands, and you are left face down, asking God where He went. The silence that follows a failure you did not see coming is its own kind of wilderness. God's answer was not comfort. It was a diagnosis. Someone inside the camp had taken plunder from Jericho that had been devoted to destruction, hidden it under his tent floor, and said nothing. Sin, unconfessed, does not stay contained to the person carrying it. It spreads its weight onto everyone standing nearby. The man was found. The stolen silver, the gold, the robe he had buried in the dirt of his own tent were dug up and laid out in front of the whole nation. Undeniable evidence of what one hidden choice had cost an entire army. Joshua led the people back to Ai a second time, and this time the city fell exactly as Jericho had. But the failure at Ai had done something to Joshua that the victory at Jericho never could. It had shown him that walls were never really the danger. Hidden things were. In the seasons that followed, city after city rose against Israel in shifting alliances. 5 kings banding together to crush the small nation before it could spread any further. And each time, Joshua marched out to face armies that outnumbered his own. There was a day the sun itself seemed to stand still in the sky, giving Israel's soldiers enough daylight to finish a battle that should have ended in darkness. There was a night march up a mountain pass so steep and so exhausting that only a man convinced God was walking beside him could have pushed his soldiers through it. Seasons turned, cities fell. Kings who had once ruled walled fortresses were buried beneath the stones of their own gates. And through every one of those campaigns, on the nights when the outcome was not yet decided, Joshua would remember 4 words spoken to him once at the edge of a flooded river. Be strong and courageous. He said them to himself the night before Ai's second battle, standing outside his tent with the smell of yesterday's defeat still in the air. He was not fighting for a kingdom that already belonged to him. He was fighting for a promise he had chosen to believe before he had any way of knowing it would hold. By the time the fighting ended, the land was divided, tribe by tribe, family by family, among a people who had spent their entire lives and their parents' entire lives owning nothing but tents and manna. Joshua, the man who had once been a spy nobody believed, stood at the head of a nation now standing on ground God had promised to Abraham centuries before any of them were born. He was old now. The wars were behind him. And before he died, he gathered the tribes of Israel one final time, not to celebrate a conquest, but to ask them a question. Choose this day whom you will serve. He reminded them of everything: the river that had parted, the wall that had fallen, the sun that had stood still, the God who had kept every single promise he had ever made to them, without exception. And then he told them plainly that they were free to walk away from that God if they wanted to, free to worship whatever gods their ancestors had served on the other side of the river, or the gods of the land they now stood on. But as for me and my house, he said, we will serve the Lord. That is the sentence a whole life had been building toward, not a victory speech, a choice, spoken out loud, in front of everyone, by a man who had learned that the hardest battles were never really against walled cities. They were against fear and forgetfulness, and the quiet temptation to trust something smaller than the God who had never once failed him. Here is what this story is asking of you, the same thing it asked of a frightened commander at the edge of a river 3,000 years ago. There will be a Jordan in your life, a moment where the way forward looks flooded, and no one can promise you the water will part before you step in. Faith rarely gets to see the outcome before it commits to the step. There will be an AI, a defeat you did not see coming, arriving right after a victory that made you careless. And somewhere in that defeat, there may be a hidden thing you have buried under your own tent floor that needs to be dug up and dealt with honestly, not hidden further. And there will be a day, whether you are old or young when it comes, when you will have to answer Joshua's question for yourself. Not what your parents believed, not what your community assumes about you, what you, standing in front of your own life, choose to serve. The writer of Hebrews would later look back at this whole story and say that it was by faith the walls of Jericho fell down, after the people had marched around them for 7 days. And by faith, the prostitute Rahab did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had welcomed the spies in peace.
Please come inside.
An enemy who
My home
believed
is your refuge.
became family. A nation that believed became a kingdom. You do not have to have Joshua's courage before you take the step. You only have to take the step and let the courage catch up to you in the water. Be strong and courageous. The God who stood at the edge of that river with a frightened man 3,000 years ago is still standing at the edge of yours. Based on the book of Joshua, with reference to Hebrews 11:30-31 and Joshua 24:15.